This is the first in a series of 3 videos. Each video will examine a different myth of gifted education and ask the questions, well, where does this myth come from? What is at the heart of it? What makes it a myth? Why is it wrong? And finally, why is it so dangerous? Let's take a look at how the myth initially emerged. When we think about our history, we can see how this myth has pervaded the field. One of the earliest and most prominent scholars in the field of giftedness was Galton, who between 1888 and 1894 developed and compiled measurements of over 7,500 individuals to gauge their natural intellectual abilities. He presented 4 categories of people's intellectual aptitude: gifted, capable, average, or degenerate, and recommended breeding between the first 2 categories only. Through studying England's most prominent families, he concluded that a person's eminence was directly related to their hereditary line and was passed down genetically. Galton's findings presented a view of intellectual giftedness as the special domain of the elite, the upper and middle classes. So the way that giftedness was initially identified was indeed highly elitist. However, gifted education has come a long way since Galtonian eugenics theories, and yet the myth is still pervasive. This is evident in the Australian educational setting. Ward suggests that our hatred of elitism originates in our beginnings as a British penal colony. The division of society into aristocracy and landed gentry, whose rule was to govern the convicts, created intense class hatred, coupled with resentment against any privilege inherited rather than acquired by honest labour. You might have heard of the tall poppy syndrome. This is a pejorative term used to describe a social phenomenon in which people of genuine merit are resented, attacked, cut down or criticised because their talents or achievements elevate them above or distinguish them from their peers. Tall poppy syndrome is rife in Australia. Gross discusses Australians' traditional suspicion of any process which might be construed as elitist. She argues that we have a reluctance to acknowledge intellectual talent even while we enthusiastically foster talent in sport and athletics. We view excellence and equity as conflicting rather than complementary, and we often confuse the concepts of gifts and strengths. In Australia, it is okay to be elite in certain fields, but not in others. The word elite is okay if it applies to sports people, but not to other fields. To cut down is, according to linguistic research by Peters, the verb that comes most naturally to the average Australian when confronted with talk about tall poppies. If we are to adhere to Gagné's differentiated model of giftedness and talent, in which the top 10% of students are considered gifted, well, these are significant numbers of students that we might be cutting down. Given that gifted students are just another group who have special learning needs, it is inequitable not to provide for them. Furthermore, the gifted students do not typically go on to become the so-called elite in society. The elite is a select group of people with a certain ancestry, intrinsic quality, high intellect, wealth, training or experience, or other distinctive attribute. Elitism is the belief that these select people are the ones whose influence or authority is greater than that of others, whose views on a matter are to be taken more seriously or carry more weight, whose views or actions are more likely to be constructive to society as a whole, or whose extraordinary skills, abilities or wisdom render them especially fit to govern. Gagné presents persuasive arguments to counter the idea that gifted children are those who will go on to form some sort of elite. Instead, he suggests that garden variety eminence is far more likely for those with gifts and talents. He suggests that eminent unknowns surround us, talented individuals who might not be famous per se, but whose talent impacts positively on the lives of those around them. The idea is that gifted individuals should filter out to every diverse field to make society better as a whole. Why are we trying to cut these people down if they make the world around them better? Some of you may have noticed a contradiction here. The idea that a select group of people whose views or actions are to be taken more seriously or carry more weight is elitist. Well, gifted research and theorists frequently argue that gifted children may go on to make society better, an elitist argument. One of the strong currents in gifted research and political agendas for gifted children is the national resource philosophy. This looks at gifted children as a valuable asset or natural resource which should be used to better nations. This argument appears as strongly in communist as it does in capitalist societies. In Australia, the Senate Select Committee in 1988 endorsed this view by noting that without the contribution of its gifted citizens, Australian society would be poorer both materially and culturally. We would be less able to compete internationally. We would be less able to sustain a level of prosperity which allows our education systems to provide for physically and intellectually disadvantaged students. We would fall behind in social and medical care and in medical and scientific research. So then, gifted programs are elitist, right? Myth unbusted. Former Minister for Education, the Honourable Kim Beazley Sr., in his keynote address to Australia's first National Conference on Gifted Education, reminded that elitism is a word properly applied to aristocratic and economic privilege, not to the recognition of special abilities or the respect due to a child in school. Beazley pointed out the potency of the term elitism as a deterrent to the establishment of programs for the intellectually gifted, stating, "I fear the power of the word elitism may lead to a refusal to see that schools and classrooms need to adjust to meet the needs and special problems of all children." One reason why gifted education can appear elitist is because it is often more commonly and easily identified in children from middle to upper class families. The South Australian gifted education policy notes that the abilities of gifted students may be masked by special needs in other areas, notably disability, poverty, isolation, gender, non-English speaking background, and Aboriginality. Similarly, the New South Wales Government emphasised the need to identify and assist gifted students from disadvantaged groups. The myth that gifted education is elitist only serves to perpetuate a failure to identify students from these apparently atypical backgrounds. It has become clear throughout this analysis that educators must take care to ensure that programs are not in fact elitist, and gifted education researchers should consider whether their arguments are elitist before they make them. When running a gifted program in a school, Paslow suggests using a could, would, should method to ensure that it is not elitist. Could all students do it? Would all students want to do it? Should all students do it? If the answer to all of these is yes, then chances are the program may be exclusive and potentially elitist if run as a gifted program. Myths that are believed in tend to come true. This is what makes this myth so dangerous. If gifted programs are seen as elitist, students who are not seen as part of some traditional elite will continue to go unrecognised, and their learning needs will continue to go unmet, and the vicious cycle begun by early gifted education research may continue.